Hi, I'm Melanie, and welcome to Yarn Journeys. Today's episode is the second in a three-part series about my trip to Vancouver and Vancouver Island. Is Vancouver Island the island of the fiber arts? Well, you'll have to tell me what you think after watching this episode. So, in today's episode, we are going to start in Victoria, the capital of British Columbia and the largest city on the island, and visit two really cool yarn shops. Then I'm going to show you some wonderful scenery of the beauty that Vancouver Island has to offer. We'll go up the east coast to the very northernmost tip of the island, and I'll show you some of the adventures we got up to. And of course, there'll be some show and tell of my current works in progress, finished objects, and I'll be talking about what's coming up next. And at the very end, we'll make a stop in Book Corner, where I will show you the very best thing I ever did to improve my knitting. So, grab a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. I'm going to take a sip here. If you've got something to knit, I hope you enjoy knitting it while you're taking in this episode, but without further ado, let's get into it. So Vancouver Island is off the coast of the British Columbia mainland, and it's about all in an hour and 45-minute ferry ride from Vancouver City itself to the island. Now, Vancouver Island actually does have a rich history in knitting. I mean, I've been to other islands that are famous for their knitting, like Ireland and Iceland, for example. But I didn't, it was, to be honest, it was my husband's idea to go to Vancouver Island because he is very into landscape photography, and there are some amazing, beautiful sites for natural beauty there. But as I began to get ready for our trip, I began to realize that Vancouver Island also has a very rich history in knitting. In fact, it is home to one of, at least the only, I should say, knitting tradition that Native Americans got involved in, or as they say in Canada, the First Nations. So around the 1880s or so, the Coast Salish people, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, were taught to knit by a Scottish immigrant to Vancouver Island. And they took their motifs and ways of doing textiles that they used in their weaving, and then applied those same motifs into knitting. Their yarn was typically a very bulky single ply. You may be more familiar with it from the sweater that was often featured in Starsky and Hutch. If you're as old as me, you might remember Starsky and Hutch. Or a little later, the dude wore a Cowichan style sweater in The Big Lebowski. So I am not going to say much about Cowichan sweaters or Cowichan style knitting here, because there's some great resources about it if you want to go further. But that was my first clue that there was some interesting fiber arts and knitting stuff going on Vancouver Island. As it turns out, this island is home to some amazing hand dyers, spinners, weavers, textiles. There's enough going on to support 3 fiber festivals over the course of the year. Wow. We started and ended our 3-week trip on Vancouver Island in Victoria, as I mentioned, the capital of British Columbia. And the first yarn shop we went to was the Beehive Wool Shop, which is right downtown in a gorgeous Victorian style Masonic temple building. The windows had an amazing display of artworks by a local fiber artist that featured knitting and applique. So the Beehive Wool Shop has been in existence since 1906. So it's been continuously operating for the past 115 years, although its current location is not the original location. I, of course, had seen a preview of Beehive Wool Shop in the Knotty Stews episode about Vancouver Island. And if you don't know the Knotty Stew, I highly recommend her. So the Knotty Stew is a Canadian flight attendant who on YouTube tells you all about her travels and adventures to yarn shops and cities across Canada. So she clued me in that the Beehive Wool Shop was a place to visit, and she was not wrong. That is one of the best yarn shops I have ever been to. So first of all, it's huge. It takes up quite a lot of space, and every inch is packed with all kinds of yarn, fiber, knitting tools, samples, what have you. We were there the day before Canadian Thanksgiving. So there were quite a lot of people in town, and that yarn shop was full of people shopping. In fact, I actually had to stand in line about 8 or 9 people deep when it came time for me to make a purchase. I've never been in a yarn shop that was that busy, except for perhaps in a fiber festival. It was really quite amazing. The Beehive Wool Shop had a great collection of samples and curated kits so that you could knit up whatever the sample was displaying, particularly for beginners. Samples for shawls, samples for cowls, and so on. And they were spread all over the store, along with beautiful tools and notions that were unlike others I'd seen elsewhere. There was lots of staff around, identified at least, I think there were about 5 people working that day, and they all had name tags, which I'd never seen in a yarn shop, what I thought was a nice touch. What I really appreciated was Beehive Wool's great selection of Canadian yarn brands. I already knew to look for Briggs and Little, for example, but they also had Ancient Arts, Leo and Roxy, as well as Gathering Yarn, which is a Canadian brand that has yarn of all kinds and all sorts. Some sourced from wool that comes from England, others is from Canadian producers. Among Gathering Yarns, wool, I found this lovely hand-dyed sock yarn called Summertime Painted Sock. And it's that lovely cornflower blue. It's called Sky. And it's summertime sock because it's 70% wool, 15% bamboo, and 15% cotton. So this will be better for the spring, and I look forward to knitting up some socks with this stuff. But it is hand-dyed on Vancouver Island. I also purchased at Beehive Wool Shop a little project bag. And I think their logo is just adorable with their sheep knitting in a chair. Now, as I was checking out, I noticed they had something on the counter there, and it said Annual Cowichan Fleece and Fiber Fair. And I said, uh-oh, we're going to be here on that date on October 22nd. And that's when I really knew that here on Vancouver Island that I was going to be in for a fun fiber time. I'll be talking about this knitting festival in my next episode, but more fun things to come. We spent our final couple days on Vancouver Island also in Vancouver, and that's when I visited Victoria's other famous yarn shop called Knotty by Nature. And not to make another reference to my age, but when I hear Knotty by Nature, I think of that hip hop band from the 1990s that I heard a lot of when I was in college. So I'm already thinking, well, this is fun. And it indeed was fun. Knotty by Nature is a yarn shop. Well, it's actually a fiber arts shop. They have stuff to do with knitting, spinning, they have weaving, and even a little bit of sewing. And the place is packed to the gills with all sorts of fun things to look at. Knotty by Nature is in a neighborhood called Fernwood in Victoria, which is really quite funky. There's lots of murals, really cool boutiques and coffee shops. And in fact, as I was walking from where we parked our van to go to the shop, I passed a coffee shop where I saw two friends knitting, and one was clearly teaching the other how to knit, which I thought was really sweet. And I wished I had the gumption to take a picture or a short video of that, but I didn't want to call attention to myself. So I lost that opportunity. But anywho, you can tell that Knotty by Nature is going to be really deep into the fiber arts, because on the front porch there's looms, there's spinning wheels, and there's even an ironing board. And as soon as you walk in, there is just a wall of braids of spinning fiber and mixing and spinning fiber mix-ins, and all just a riot of color and fluffy stuff. On the left, there is a whole bunch of different kinds of yarn. There is weaving cotton. There are spinning wheels tucked all over the place. There's hand carders. It's just so much to look at. They also had a nice selection of Canadian yarn brands. And one, in fact, I was really interested in was called Custom Woolen Mills. And they had their prairie yarn lines for sale, which is this really sort of fluffy, almost unspun fiber. And I had heard tell of it, I think, both on the Knitty Stew as well as on Rachel Smith's podcast channel, the Woolen Spinning Podcast. Another one to look up if you don't already know about it. In fact, there are some really awesome YouTube knitting podcasters from Canada. So good on you, Canada, for having such great knitting and wool content. Knotty by Nature is actually owned and run by a husband and wife. And the husband, Ryan, is the hand dyer of the two. And so he was telling me all about his hand dyed fiber, and how he blends and mixes, Ashford merino with a bunch of other kinds of fibers like alpaca and silk and so forth. So I, of course, had to make a purchase there. And I really, I have this channel that's pretty much all about travel and visiting yarn shops and yarn festivals. And I feel duty bound when I go to these shops to make a purchase because I feel like I want to honor these people who are courageous enough to open a yarn shop or fiber business and keep it going. But at the same time, I don't want to be growing my stash just for making purchases and consuming. So whenever I am in a yarn shop and I feel like I would like to make a purchase, I always try and think about, how am I going to use this? Or how is this special versus something that I could get somewhere else? Or how is this representative of this spot where I'm traveling to? So I apologize. This is a bit of a digression, but I think it's, as knitters and spinners, we talk about our stashes all the time, and we talk about how they get too big, and we keep buying yarn and fiber and so forth. So I think this is a useful digression, so bear with me. So, a good example is the sweater I'm wearing right now. This is a pattern by Jen Steingass, knit with Icelandic wool. I talked about the sweater in my episode on Iceland, but it is Icelandic hand-dyed wool. At least the pink is, the gray is natural. But it comes from a very specific wool workshop in Iceland, the Thingborg Wool Workshop, and you cannot get this wool except in Iceland. You can order it online if you speak Icelandic, because they don't have an English version of their website. So I knew that when I bought this wool, that it was going to be very special for that place for my trip to Iceland. So when I was at Knotty by Nature, I ended up getting some hand-dyed roving that Ryan, one of the owners of the shop, created himself. And so this is 80% merino and 20% silk. It's about 4 ounces. And this is definitely my jam, because I love these moody, bluey grays. And you can see the bits of sari silk, because he told me that was actually sari silk that he had blended in. I've got quite a decent size fiber stash now. So eventually I'm sure I'll get to this. So I'm curious, what's your take on stash building? This is a channel for people who like to travel, who like to visit yarn shops. And I am hoping to give you a flavor of, if you go to these places, what you might see there and what you might be interested to shop for. Do you have a theory about when it's appropriate to buy or not to buy? Do you buy yarn when it catches your eye, or do you always have a project in mind? I think it's important to have this conversation because hand-dyed wool and hand-dyed fiber, and in particularly fiber that's not mass-produced from small mills, is way more expensive than those that are coming from larger brands and larger mills. Something that is hand dyed or hand spun or is spun from a small producer is going to be twice the price of a Malabrigo or a Barocco. And so I guess what I am trying to come up with is a theory or a guideline for stash building so that I'm not just spending money thoughtlessly, because that's not good for anybody. But sort of, makes sure that I am honoring the fiber artists who are creating the yarn, creating the fiber, the shepherds for growing the fiber, that I am honoring their work, but at the same time, not just stash building for its own sake. Not sure if I'm making sense, but what do you think? I really would like to know. Now let's take a look at some wonderful scenery from our trip. The ferry ride to Victoria gave us a preview of the beautiful Pacific Northwest landscape of Vancouver Island. The city of Victoria is beautiful in the morning with the dawn sun and the rocks and the water. And at night they light up the Parliament building. We took in Victoria's famous Chinatown. And we got to hear a rousing rendition of Canada's national anthem because Victoria's marathon was happening while we were there, which explained why hotels were so expensive that weekend.
Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! And now off.
But soon we were off in our camper van, driving around the island and going on hikes to beautiful waterfalls. A lone seal was taking in the beautiful sunrise at Rathtrevor Beach. Well, I'm here at Englishman River Falls, Vancouver Island. So beautiful. Spent our first night in the camper van last night at the Rathtrevor campground. It went pretty good. We're still getting used to the whole camper van deal. But this Pacific Northwest natural beauty is just gorgeous. You can see the falls through the trees behind me here. But there's just this beautiful, I don't know if you can see it, there's a beautiful tree behind me that is covered in moss. It's right up there. It is just astounding, and haven't spent a lot of time in this kind of beauty before, so I'm really enjoying it. And of course, I got some knitting in while my husband was taking some photographs. Good morning. It is Tuesday, October 11th, the day after Canadian Thanksgiving. We spent last night at the Raedwulf River campground. We have a beautiful lakeside campsite there with a view of the mountains. We right now are at Little Myra Falls, so you can see them and probably hear them. They're right there. My husband is doing some photographing, and I am doing some knitting. I am working on Stephen West's Dustland socks. Previously, I with this same yarn, which is La Bien Aimé's Super Sock in the shade called Lannister. I had been working on a sock by Anna Johanna. I forget what the pattern was called. Anyway, when it came to working the gusset and the heel, everything just got sort of really fussy in the construction of the heel and the gusset, and I wasn't enjoying knitting the sock and knew that I wasn't going to want to do more than what I had. So this pattern by Stephen West has a couple cool things in it. Mostly knit purl pattern across on the instep and the leg, so it'll keep me interested without being too tricky or fussy. So in the meantime, I am going to just enjoy the view, and yeah, that's the scoop. Here's a look at our beautiful campsite in the Raedwulf River campground on Buttle Lake in Strathcona Provincial Park. On the edge of Buttle Lake, there's what looks to be a tree graveyard, and it's a bit spooky. But this guy here, this makes me happy. It's like this little tree has decided it's gonna live. I'd like to think it's actually the original tree making a big comeback, but that's probably not the case. I don't know what kind of animal that is, but it is too big and there's claws. Could be a cougar, doesn't look like a bear. Not a bad spot to sit and knit, is it? Karst Creek Waterfalls in Strathcona Provincial Park. I'm not usually a big fan of heights, but I'm doing this bridge. It's quite beautiful. Here, I'm gonna look up and show you what there is to see. The Campbell River. Alright, gotta keep going here. Camping and hiking gives a great opportunity to bring out the hand knits. So a little tour of our campsite here.
north of Port McNeill at the Cluxway Resort. Here is our Go Campers camper van. And it's right on the water. And you can see across to the mountains of British Columbia. It is a gorgeous, peaceful place to be. It's beautiful. Yeah, he's kind of got a similar shape to a cardinal.
We then headed north to the most remote, wildest part of the island in Cape Scott Provincial Park.
It's beautiful morning light in the... Where are we again? Oh yeah, we're taking the trail to San Joseph Bay. It's about 8 a.m. in the morning. Birds twittering. Sun rose about half an hour ago.
We got to see some amazing, ancient, huge, tall trees. This was one of my favorite hikes on the island, with these gorgeous trees and light and green moss, and it also happened to be nice and flat, so not a ton of climbing. These 3 trees had the most unusual root foundation I had ever seen. It was a long hike to get to the beach, but the play of light on the trees was just gorgeous.
In that tree is by far the biggest raven I have ever seen. It's huge.
And because it was so early when we got to the beach, we had the beautiful view almost all to ourselves.
These are the famous pinnacles of San Joseph Bay. Good morning. Sun is a bit bright here, but found a good spot here in San Joseph's Bay to do some knitting, enjoy the morning while my husband does his photography. The tide is going out, so we have an amazing view of these, what they call these pinnacles or little islands that get revealed as the water recedes. So, another day of lovely bright sun in the Pacific Northwest. I was expecting lots of rain and clouds, but so far it hasn't happened. Not complaining though.
And to cap off what was already an amazing morning, we saw a bear. And that night we enjoyed a beautiful campfire to cap off an amazing day. And the next day we headed to Little Huson Caves, which actually isn't a cave, but a natural bridge that this
creek has cut through the rock. And there were some nice little fishes swimming among the rocks. And this is a rather good example of one of Vancouver Island's famous slugs. The Cumberland potholes are another one of Vancouver Island's famous rock formations, but unfortunately, there was very little water to show them off. But still, they're quite beautiful. And it was another great place to get some knitting done, as well as start a new fashion trend of wearing sunglasses and reading glasses at the same time.
So now it's time for some show and tell. Of course, by now I have finished those Dustland socks that you saw me knitting at Lower Myra Falls. But I'm not going to show them until the next episode because I hadn't finished them yet by the time I'd gotten to this point in Vancouver Island. So I'm not keeping them from you. They're just not ready to be shown just yet. In terms of works in progress, I have made quite a bit of progress on my weekender, which is stuck here. Blah. All right, here's my weekender. And yeah, this is the front. It's still a bit... as I mentioned last week, I cast on again, and I have made it all the way up to the start of the armholes, and now I am knitting the front in flat, and I'm about to start the short rows. It's still a bit wider than I'd hoped, but I'm gonna live with it. And I think it's going to be just fine. So I'm so happy with how the hand spun, this Targhee, which is a bit lumpy bumpy, is coming out. Now, actually, this is the wrong side because the outside is reverse stockinette. So that's why you saw my ends there. But this is what the front will look like when it's done with the reverse stockinette and that faux seam of slipped knit stitches. So I am very pleased, and it's coming together quite quickly now. Let's see what else. So another thing I have on my needles is a cowl I am making with Zephyret from Flying Goat Farm. I think I may have mentioned previously that I visited Flying Goat Farm in Frederick, Maryland. It is a Angora goat farm, but there's also other kinds of hand-dyed fiber there. She's got wool, all sorts of cool stuff. And I also saw her at Lisa is the owner's name. I saw Lisa at the Shenandoah Valley Fiber Festival. But Zephyret is a mix of Surrey alpaca, silk, and cashmere. And it is so soft. And I have been thinking about what I wanted to make with this Zephyret for a while now. This was something that I added to my stash because I loved how soft it was and I loved all the colors, but I actually wasn't sure what I was going to make with it. So I've been swatching and playing with it for the past several weeks. Now, it being mostly alpaca and silk, it doesn't have a lot of bounce and stretch. So hats were going to not be an option. I didn't have enough to make a larger garment, so I began looking at cowls. It's called sport weight, and that's because there's a fairly, it actually feels to your fingers more like fingering, but there's quite a bit of halo to it, so it does knit up more like sport. And so finally, I was perusing through cowls in Ravelry, particularly the color work cowls, and I found this pattern by Nat Raedwulf. I hope I am pronouncing this correctly. It's called the Rivers and Ravens cowls. And totally not at all by intention, turns out that Nat is from Vancouver Island. And this is based on the wildlife and inspiration that she finds on Vancouver Island. And as you've seen, there are ravens there for sure, big ones. So this is knitting up beautifully. It's mosaic, and it's kind of like a Greek key pattern almost. I hope it is picking up here. But indeed, it is super soft. I'm loving working with this. And I think this kind of yarn is very well suited to mosaic color work or slip stitch color work. I actually swatched a bit with doing more Fair Isle stranded technique. And it didn't feel good on the hands, but mosaic is working out really well, and I'm just so pleased with it. I'm going to show it off again. I think the colors, this is pecan, is the sort of gray brown, and the color fiber is called rooster. So that is my Rivers and Ravens cowl. If you are a fan of Andrea Mowry, as if you've watched this channel before, you know that I am. Today starts her annual fall sock challenge, where over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, starting tonight at 5 p.m., going through Monday at noon, you have the holiday weekend, to knit socks. She comes up with a new pattern for this challenge every year. This year, it's a DK weight version of her DRK everyday socks. She's also made a version of this DK sock pattern where instead of one strand of DK weight yarn, you hold two fingering strands together. And I was like, well, I have the perfect pair for just this sock pattern. If you've watched my Blue Ridge episode, this will look familiar to you. It is the pair of BFL and nylon sock yarn that I got at the House Mountain Yarn Company in Lexington, Virginia. If I remember correctly, this is by Beehive, and this is from the Knitting Coop. And they were sold as a pair as part of the Blue Ridge Yarn Crawl. And you can watch my Blue Ridge episode to find out more about that. But I thought maybe I would make a shawl with these two, but then I found out about this new pattern for the sock challenge, and I was like, yay, I have the perfect yarn in my stash. So I will be casting on this evening. And in the next episode, you'll see if I actually was able to complete the challenge and knit 2 socks completely by Monday at 5. I don't know. We'll have to see. that is a challenge for sure. And I think this year I am developing a thing for this color blue, because it's also not that different from the color of my Curdock cardigan. Now we are going to go to book corner. And today, what I want to talk about is the best thing I ever did to improve my knitting. Back in the mid 1990s, when I really decided that I wanted to learn how to knit, there was no YouTube. There were just sort of knitting books and knitting stores. And summer of 1995, and that is when I really went whole hog into knitting. And I spent the winter of that knitting my very first sweater. But I wanted to learn how to make more complicated things. So what I did was to buy a stitch dictionary. So this is the stitch dictionary that I got. It's the Harmony Guide to Knitting Stitches. Now, unfortunately, this book is out of print, but you can still find them used. And there's actually 3 more volumes of it. There are other stitch dictionaries available. There's, I think Barbara Walker's is still available in print. But I highly recommend that you look up a stitch dictionary if you haven't, and even get used ones. Now, you might be thinking, I'm not a designer. I really don't want a stitch dictionary. Don't need one. I'm not really interested in coming up with my own patterns. That sounds like way too tricky or just not what I'm into. I'd like to change your mind. If you want to get to be a better knitter, a faster knitter, more nimble with your needles, this is a project I recommend. There is no pattern. It's a scarf. Now you may be thinking, really, Melanie, a scarf? Nobody knits scarves. Everybody's knitting cowls and shawls. This is true. If you go on Ravelry in the Hot Right Now pages, I think you have to go, actually, the petite knit scarf is one of the most popular designs right now, but that kind of doesn't count. This is a bona fide scarf. It's a muffler. So I knit this the summer I went to graduate school. And I went to graduate school in Michigan. So this big long scarf doesn't owe me a thing. I got lots of use of it, and I still use it today. It is made from alpaca. And so here's what I did. My pattern was I cast on a certain number of knitting stitches, and then every 3, 4, 5 inches, I changed the pattern. And so I started with the knit and purl patterns at the beginning. So like in the beginning, and then I went into more complicated patterns, and I even did some lace ones. So you can see, these are the knit and purl patterns, and then I started getting into more complicated ones. There's a lace. Am I showing the right side? No, I'm not. Here's a twisted stitch pattern. Here's a cable pattern. Here's one that combines sort of lace and slip stitches. So, and then there was this tweed pattern, and then I think there's this sort of lace and bobble pattern at the end. So as I started from one end all the way to the other, I got more comfortable with more complicated knitting stitches, and I got to choose which ones I wanted to try. It didn't take me very long, and my knitting got faster, my knits and purls got more even, and I just got super comfortable with manipulating my knitting needles. So if you are a beginner, or if you are wanting to try more complicated knitting stitches, but don't necessarily want to commit to a whole lace sweater or a whole lace shawl, or just want to try different things, make a scarf like this one with a stitch dictionary. It's not only for designers. So that is the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed spending time with me. Once again, if you celebrate American Thanksgiving, I wish you and yours a very happy holiday. So, what do you think? Is Vancouver Island the island of the fiber arts? Let me know what you think in the comments. And please stay tuned for the next installment of this series, where we visit a couple more yarn shops, take in a fiber festival, and I'll show you the rest of the beautiful scenery to be found in Vancouver Island. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.
And as always, please don't forget to give this episode a like if you enjoyed today's content, and subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode.
I'm sorry, I am totally distracted because I have fluff on my lip. So, bear with me. Hazard of the knitting podcaster. Fluff that gets attached to your lip gloss. All right. I think I got it.